Gretchen, before we talk about this important legislation, can you tell us why it was needed in the first place?
Because if you have a forced arbitration clause in your contract, and you probably don't even know if you have it, because sometimes it's in the fine print or even in the handbook that you just click on an email to approve, it means that if you have a problem at work, you cannot go to the open court system. You have to go into something called forced arbitration that is a secret place. The company picks the arbitrator for you. You don't get the same amount of witnesses or depositions. There are no appeals. It's secret. The perpetrator gets to stay working because nobody knows that you've gone to this arbitration case because it's secret. So no, you can't warn anyone else in the workplace about it. Only 2% of all cases are actually found in favor for the employee because the arbitrator comes back for repeat business for the company. So this process is pushing out the very people that companies want to retain for their bottom line, meaning a more diverse workforce, women, people of color. And so when I pitch this to executives, they kind of scratch their head and they're like, are we doing this? And in many cases, they've changed the policy on that day because they want to retain those people and they don't even have a full understanding themselves of what these clauses are doing to people.
And hopefully they don't want to protect the perpetrators and keep them employed.
Yeah. Sometimes, look, when the perpetrator's at the top of the company, they want to protect everyone because they want to protect themselves and they tend to hire people who are just like them. So if the perpetrator's not at the top and you actually have a CEO that really wants to fix these issues, then yes, you have a chance of getting to them and educating them. At my nonprofit, Lift Our Voices, we're trying to get rid of both forced arbitration and NDAs for toxic workplace issues, because we believe those are the two silver bullets to equity in the workplace. When you sign an NDA on your first day of employment, you think you're just signing the NDA saying that you can't talk about trade secrets, right? Like the recipe for Kentucky Fried Chicken or something. But instead, you're signing away all of your ability to talk about your pay, to talk about if you're discriminated against. And so on your first day, you're just excited to get a paycheck. Then something bad happens to you and you're screwed. And so these are the two mechanisms that we are trying to get companies to eliminate.
Tell us about the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act, which passed on March 3rd, which was the biggest labor law change in over 100 years.
Yeah, so I've been fighting for this, as you know, for the last 5 years since my story at Fox News, because I started hearing from all these women across our country who had been forced into secret arbitration and their stories never got out. And I was like, my God, this is its own epidemic. And I started walking the halls of Congress. And I knew it had to be bipartisan in order for it to pass. And by the way, the issue is apolitical, so it should be. And I just started rallying the troops on both sides. In February, it passed with huge bipartisan support in the House. And 3 days later, it passed in the Senate. And I just cried tears of joy. And as you said, on March 3rd, I was with President Biden and Vice President Harris at a public signing ceremony.
And it compels the people of our nation, and most often the women of our nation, to sign away one of their most fundamental rights, the right to seek justice in court. The legislation the President will sign today will end forced arbitration in all cases of sexual abuse.
Gretchen, thank you very much. You went from speaking to millions to speaking for millions and speaking for a movement.
I think when people hear about arbitration clauses, Gretchen, they often think of high-profile names, part of the Me Too movement. But this will impact millions of workers across the country who are in low-wage or hourly jobs, won't it?
I think initially the general public thought it was famous actresses and well-known journalists that were facing harassment and were the only ones, but it's everywhere. In fact, the more disenfranchised you are, the greater likelihood you are of having a forced arbitration clause in your contract. So who do you think would be the most apt to be silenced? It is an African-American woman working at a nursing home, changing bedpans. That's the reality of this.
Gretchen Carlson, who until recently was an anchor for Fox News, is suing the channel's powerful CEO, Roger Ailes.
She says she was fired because she refused Ailes' sexual advances. In a lawsuit, she claims pervasive sexual harassment and retaliation by Ailes.
If this legislation had been in place when you had your situation at Fox News with Roger Ailes, what would have been different?
Well, I had a forced arbitration clause that they put only in my last contract. Quite honestly, they were late to the game because we found out after my case that he had been an alleged predator for 50 years. You know, it was amazing that they hadn't tried to silence more people with arbitration and only did it in my last contract. But that was my darkest day, Katie, when my lawyer said to me, you have no case. You have a forced arbitration clause. No one's ever going to know about your story. And I was devastated. And so that was, luckily they came up with this strategy to sue Roger Ailes personally to at least make my case public. If we had sued Fox News, I would have immediately been triggered into arbitration and I wouldn't have been able to make a public splash with it. It would have dramatically changed my case if we hadn't come up with that loophole.
You've been a broadcast journalist for many years, and now you are really an activist. What has it been like for you to make this transition?
Well, you know, as a journalist, you're never supposed to be the story. And I never intended to be. I mean, listen, it's not, my life has worked in totally mysterious ways, but I never like aspired to have on my resume poster child for harassment in the workplace. But the one constant in my life has been that I work incredibly hard and I get shit done. My husband always says to me, how are you more busy now than when you did a live TV show nationally every single day? And I say, well, it's hard to change the world. It takes a lot of time.
Gretchen, thank you.
Thanks, Katie.